Okay, so today we're going to be talking about color psychology, and I have a few things in mind, a few different subjects, but I wanted to go over first what we aren't going to go over and what we are going to go over. So what exactly are we going to cover? This is, when I think of color psychology, I think the first thing that comes to mind for most people is this. So if you've gone to like a design class, or if you've been to school, or even just watch some YouTube videos, normally you'll hear people talk about like, oh, McDonald's is, you know, red and yellow because those colors make you hungry, right? This is called something, if you have watched my stream on Gestalt principles, this is something called isomorphic correspondence, and it's basically cultural psychology. So it's kind of like culturally we see something a certain way because everyone else sees it that way. So if everyone feels like red and yellow makes you hungry, like it's a pretty common thing. There's not really like a huge science behind if this is real or if this is true or not. But because we all believe it's true, it kind of works out. So when you think of blue and green as like calm colors, it's because culturally we all associate it as those are calm colors, right? But this is not exactly what we're going to be talking about today. If you want to learn more about cultural psychology and the cultural significance of color, this is the book I would recommend. You guys may have heard me talk about it before, but it's called The Designer's Dictionary of Color. It's a very straightforward book. It's great for like visual inspiration. And for the most part, it talks about specific colors. So like here's one of the spreads talking about red. It'll say kind of the significance of it, how people see it, you know, if it's why it's an aggressive color. It gives a little bit of context, a little bit of history. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, that is the book I would recommend. We're going to be talking more on the science of color and our perception of it. So rather than culturally, which is more of what we believe, it's subjective, it can change over time. You know, if brands, like if yoga brands eventually started doing red as their brand color, I'm sure eventually we would come to associate red as a calm color, right? Because culturally that's how we would perceive it. We're going to be talking about the actual science, where it's just facts, it doesn't change. And the two things specifically I wanted to talk about today is color hierarchy and Albers color studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those mean in a little bit. But those are the two subjects, more science-based, more fact-based, and it's going to be very, very fun. These are two of my favorite subjects to talk about in design, despite me not using color very often for my brand, right? You might be asking to yourself, why is this even important? Why would I even want to learn about color? Like, what is this going to do for me, right? And essentially, the way I see it is, if you can understand color, you can use it intentionally. So color is a tool for design. It's something that you can use to make your design stronger. It can create hierarchy if you know how to use it right. So that's kind of why I want to talk about the science behind all of this, because I want you guys to take that information, use it however you want. For me, it's always been like nice to just have in my tool belt for if I use color, I at least know why I'm using these colors and how to pick them out and how to adjust them, stuff like that. So that's the importance of this. The significance is if you can understand it, you'll be able to use it intentionally when you design, right? So we'll just jump right into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is color hierarchy. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like, but basically it's this idea that colors, naturally, they have different levels of brightness. I'm switching to a white background, and I'm going to talk about that, why I would do that in a little bit, but essentially what you're seeing here is 100% yellow and 100% blue. So despite the fact that they are 100% of one color, you'll notice that naturally one of them is brighter than the other one. So brighter being like it feels lighter. So yellow naturally is the brightest color. It's super close to white. Blue has this kind of weight to it. It feels heavier. So you'll see it creates more contrast against the background. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here, is that colors have these kind of different groupings, these different weights, and even if you're using 100% of one color, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have the same weight as 100% of another color. So you can see how I have it grouped here. So things like 100% yellow, green is very, very bright. Things like orange and red are kind of in the middle. So they have like more of a mid-tone to them. They're very easy to use for like a mid-tone in like design color palettes. And then you have things like blue and purple where they just have a lot of weight to them naturally and they are naturally dark. So that's why you see navy blue is used a lot as a background color, right? Because it naturally has this darkness to it. So I have an example here just to kind of go over that, why that's important. So you can see here the way you mix colors together when you create a color palette. You maybe have experienced this before if you've used a color palette before in the past, or you've created a color palette and then you've decided to switch those colors and you kind of notice that suddenly the design doesn't work anymore. So that's why, because things will change in hierarchy based on how bright or how dark they are. And I have another example here too. I have an image here, an illustration, right? And you can see how the colors interact with each other, how the hierarchy of them is the brightness of these yellows here. It has like this pop to it. It feels very light. What I did is I went into Photoshop and I just shifted every color so that it would be the opposite. So instead of this orangish yellow, it's blue. So you'll notice that even though the color palette is the same but shifted, you'll see that the hierarchy of the design changes, right? So now these colors feel a lot heavier. They feel a lot darker, the blue, rather than what you have here is the yellow feels brighter. It's the focus. And in the background, you have these kind of muted greens. So because the color palette switches, it changes the hierarchy of how you perceive these colors. So that's kind of the importance here. This slide, this yellow and blue, what I wanted to showcase was how you fix that is you have to be aware of how to adjust these colors so that they are more balanced. Using color effectively is kind of like having a good understanding of color balance. If the issue here is that yellow is too bright and blue is too dark, you need to solve that problem by making the yellow a little bit darker and making the blue a little bit brighter, right? So you add a little bit of white to the blue to make it feel lighter. And what you'll notice is that when you compare these two slides, suddenly it goes from being light, dark to feeling very balanced, feeling neutral. So that's essentially how you can fix color palettes. If you decide to change your colors or if you switch your color palette, maybe you're working on a logo and you change the color palette in the logo, that's what you have to be aware of, is that because naturally colors have a different level of weight to them, you'll need to adjust the brightness or darkness based on that. So if it's yellow, you'll want to make that yellow a little bit darker to compensate for the fact that blue is naturally dark. The reason why you want to do this is that by adjusting the colors, you can balance them out, and that's how you can keep the hierarchy the same. So if you've ever noticed when you switch your color palettes in a design, it's like, oh man, now it doesn't work anymore, that's generally why you do it. The next thing I wanted to talk about, and this is probably the bigger of the two, this is basically what I spent 3 or 4 months in school learning, and that is the Albers color studies. This pretty much blew my mind when I learned it, so I'm excited to share it with you guys. But it's basically a study done by this guy, Joseph Albers. He focused on the science of color and how we perceive it based on how it interacts with other colors. So he created a book called Interaction, and if you've seen these squares before, this is kind of, he's the one that founded this study, and there's a lot of really cool observations that he makes throughout it. Maybe you guys have seen an optical illusion like this before, but if you haven't, basically the idea here is square A and square B, which one looks darker, right? The idea here is that people would say the A is the darker color, it's a darker shade of gray, but the illusion here is that they're actually both the same, right? So A is the same gray as B here. This is what this entire study is about, and if you can grasp the concept of how this works visually, you can use it to your advantage as a designer. Maybe I can show you guys if I crop it. Right. So there's A, and let me see if I can get B here. Yeah, see? They're the same color. Crazy, right? I did it live just to prove it. So that's the illusion here. And this isn't just a one-time thing. This applies to everything that we do when we use color. Here's what I wanted to talk about. So I mentioned this earlier. You guys may have noticed that I switched the background from being normally black. And when I did these colors here, these swatches, I switched the background to white. And that's the exact reason why I did it. If you're going to take anything from this stream, from this lecture, this is the most important thing. Completely changed my life when I look at color, and it's that color is never isolated. So you never see color purely by itself. You can never see just pure blue, you know? Because there's always going to be something surrounding it. So, for example, if I were to take this blue, is this blue by itself? I can even get rid of the text here, right? Is this blue isolated? And on the page, it's isolated because it's the only piece of color on the composition. But in reality, it's not, because there's white behind it. There's gray surrounding the white. You have the color from my webcam. You have the different levels of gray from like the ruler, the slides. So that's kind of what I mean. Color is never by itself. Even if you were to fill your entire computer monitor with blue, you would still have the edges of the monitor. You would still have the wall that it's against. It's always going to be influenced by something that's surrounding it. So that's kind of the main idea there. Your entire life is basically situations like this happening all the time. I have some examples here, and this is what we learned in school, which is really cool. And I'm going to be, just to make it as neutral as possible, instead of doing solid black, I'm just going to keep it 50% gray, just so I can get the point across. So I'll show you guys a few different studies, and these are kind of very basic, but you can get really creative with them, and you can even try them out yourself. That's what we had to do for school. What you'll see here is I have a white background, I have a black background, and then I have the same blue. If you look at these individually, it might be really easy to say, well, yeah, this blue is darker, right? This is the brighter blue, this one's darker, you know? Because what's happening is when it's put up against a dark background, the contrast is higher and it makes it look brighter, right? So this blue looks slightly brighter, but if you were to put them right next to each other, they would be the same blue, right? It's the same idea as that optical illusion, but instead of just being grays, it's incorporating color into it. Another example here is with yellow. So you can see the lack of contrast here. When it's against a white background, it looks slightly darker. When it's against a black background, it looks really bright. It pops out. The science behind why this is possible is because background colors extract what's in front of them. So it pulls away what's in front of itself, right? So for example, if we go back to this example here, the reason why this blue looks brighter than this one is because with a black background behind it, it's pulling the dark away from it. So you can almost think of it as being like an eyedropper or like a vacuum, and it's taking all the darkness from that color and it's just sucking it out. And because of that, it's making it look brighter. You can see this example. It doesn't just have to be with black and white. This is kind of where you can get really creative with it, but you can also do it with color. So it's the same idea here. I have, if I pull this eyedropper here, I have blue, so 200 blue, and here I have 200 green, and for the swatch in the middle, I have it 200 green and 200 blue, so it's both, right? It takes both of those colors, it blends it together, kind of the same way when you mix red and yellow, you get orange, right? So I'm kind of doing the same thing here, and the point I'm trying to show is that when you have a blue background, essentially what it's doing is it's pulling the blue from this swatch in the center and it's making it slightly more green. And the blue here, because there's a green background behind it, it's sucking the green from this swatch and it's making it look more blue. So they're having the opposite effect here, and that's kind of how you're able to create this illusion, is when you focus on the color that's behind it, you can use it almost as a vacuum to pull out color from objects in front of it, right? Exact same color, the same blue, but when you have something behind it, this one looks more green because there's blue behind it. This one looks more blue because there's green behind it. And you might be asking yourself like, okay, so now that I know this, why is this important? When you create color palettes as a designer, you might find that when you put colors on top of each other, maybe they don't work, right? Like this color palette isn't doing what I thought it would. The colors are getting washed out or they're not mixing well. What you need to do in these situations is just be aware of how your background is going to influence what's in front of it. So I want to show this example again, and like I've been saying, this swatch in the center here, because blue is being taken away from it, it appears more green. And the opposite effect is happening with this swatch. So this is where your designer mindset needs to kick in. And if you want to fix these, let's say your goal is to balance these colors. Let's say you want this blue to look the color you're envisioning it as. You don't want it to look more green, right? You want it to look how it's supposed to without this blue affecting it. If I open up this color picker, like I said, it's 200% green, 200% blue, or whatever, 200 units, right? So let's say this blue is behind it and it's taking the blue out of it. So now to compensate for it, you need to add more blue to it. Does that make sense? So if it's 200 green, 200 blue, you want it to appear more blue than it actually is because this blue behind it is pulling away that color. You would add blue. So I'll make it 250 blue. You can see now it kind of goes from being green to this bluish color, right? And we can switch this over to the other side and apply it the same way. So this is green behind it. The green is in the background. The blue is in the foreground. Because the science we're talking about, this background is pulling the green away from here. So to compensate for it, we just add more green to it, right? So I'll make this one 250 green. So the goal here is that you can balance these colors out. So maybe in this case, it's too much. Maybe this one looks too green. So I'm going to switch it to 225. And this is pretty much the project we did in school, is how much do you need to add or subtract? It's almost like a science lab where you have to work with these really precise measurements. So you saw there 250 was too much. It compensated for it too much because it's adding 50% more of that color. So let's bump it down to 225. Let's say, this is still looking a little bit too green. This is still looking a little bit too blue. I'm going to switch it to 215 instead of 225. So 215 here. And now you can see these colors are starting to look the same. So now they almost look like they're the same tint of blue. And the goal here is, if you can think about the science of color, you can start making those adjustments, those kind of micro adjustments, and start balancing out color by fixing it based on the context of the situation. So you have to address what's behind the color you're adjusting. It's like a scale, right? So the blue is taking away, so you need to add more blue to it to compensate, right? So that's kind of the general idea there. And for the most part, those are the two main things I wanted to talk about. So color hierarchy, the Albers color studies. Like I said, it's almost like a science lab or like a science fair with these two different concepts. So there's the idea of balancing color. You can see, here's the color that we started with. Technically, they're the same color, but because of what's behind them, they don't look like the same color. And what we just did was adjusted those colors so that they look the same, But if we were to put these side by side, you can see they're totally different, right? This has a lot more green in it. This has a lot more blue in it. But we're trying to think of the context of what's behind the image. So this is where designers kind of have that uniqueness to them, because design is not mathematical. It's not like blue is not always the same, right? Blue changes based on the context of what's around it, you know, its surrounding pieces, right? Sorry, someone rang the doorbell. But that's the general idea. You have to use your ability as a designer to see those things, those color differences, and be able to optically compensate for them. So you have to just say to yourself, like, you know what, this doesn't look right, this doesn't look balanced. I'm going to adjust the colors to, you know, add more blue or add more green. And that's your goal as a designer, right? Balance things out visually. Color hierarchy, Albers color studies. Again, color hierarchy is this idea that colors naturally have different levels of brightness. So yellow, green is bright. Orange, red is like your midtones. Blue and purple are naturally darker. And this whole presentation has been about balance. So the way you apply this to your design is you balance out these colors now that you can recognize why they change. So to make yellow and blue feel balanced, you have to make the yellow darker, you have to make the blue lighter. That's color hierarchy, right? And again, talking about this idea that color is never isolated. Color always has something surrounding it, whether it's the screen that's, you know, encasing it or the entire composition itself. Color is never just single by itself. It's always being influenced. So those are the two big things I wanted to talk about, and that was color psychology for designers. Hopefully it's cool. It was more meant to be just for fun, but very quick lecture. If you guys have any questions, let me know now and I can answer them for you, and we can kind of just hang out for the rest of the stream. For YouTube, I'm on Twitch right now, so I'm going to be answering questions with viewers. But if you want to see one of these streams, I'm live every Saturday. If you follow me on Twitter at Nowack Design, I'll be able to keep you posted on when the streams are. But that's going to be it for this lecture. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.